Thank you, Sadie. Welcome, everyone, to today's NCCOR webinar. We are delighted to have a presentation on America's eating habits, food away from home. The presentation will be followed by a one-on-one, that's a question and answer session, and then a brief announcement about upcoming NCCOR activities. So, in addition to Sadie's help, if you have a question for our speaker today at any time, you can type it into the chat box located on the right. Since all listeners today are on mute, we'll use the chat box, and we do encourage you to ask questions. If you need technical assistance, let us know in that same chat box. If you're having trouble logging into the webinar but can hear us on the phone, you can email us at NCCOR, that's NCCOR, at FHI360.org, and we'll work with you to resolve the problem. Now, one final important technical note. If you're listening to the webinar using your computer speakers, please turn down or mute your computer microphone. This will greatly reduce the potential for background noise. And we have a great number of listeners, so we want to make sure that everyone can clearly hear. We'll also be live tweeting during the webinar. If you are on Twitter or other social media platforms, we encourage you to join the conversation using the hashtag ConnectExplore and following at NCCOR on Twitter and at NCCOR.org on Facebook. Now, we're very grateful to have one of the authors of this new report from USDA's Economic Research Service, Michelle Saxena, PhD economist, is here to share the rationale for this research report and to highlight interesting findings. Now, just before I turn this over to Michelle, I want to take just a quick minute for a brief poll. You can submit your answer directly on the screen and select all answers that may apply. I'll give Michelle just a little information about who's listening today. Okay. So it looks like we're about ready to wrap it up. And I see that about 39% of you are government, 13% academia, 32% nonprofit, food industry 1.25%, restaurant industry is not with us today, and then a number of others as well. Thank you all so much for joining us. So at this point, I would like to turn it over to Michelle.
Great. Hi, everyone. Just as Elaine said, my name is Michelle Saxena. I'm an economist at the Economic Research Service, and today I'm going to talk about a recent ERS publication called America's Eating Habits, Food Away from Home. This first slide just shows the cover page of our report, and right in the bottom right-hand corner is a link to the report, and you can download and read it right after this presentation if you really want to. So before I kind of get into the meat of the presentation, I wanted to talk a little bit about the project itself. This project is quite unique to ERS. Most of our publications are usually around 30 to 50 pages long, and they're authored usually by a small number of people. But as you can see from the screen, this report is the work of many. There were 10 chapters and 20 authors overall. Myself and my colleague Abigail Okren and my former colleague Karen Hamrick were the editors of this report. If you want to go and download the report from our website, it doesn't show the authors by chapter right now. But we put them up here on this slide just in case there's a, if there's a graph or a chapter of the report that interests you, then this will help you to find the right person. And of course, you can contact me or Abby about further information, and we would be happy to connect you with the right people. So before I get into the findings, I just wanted to talk a little bit behind the motivation of the report. So there were several reasons as the impetus for this report. The first, and maybe perhaps the most obvious reason, was that an earlier report called Americans' Eating Habits, Changes and Consequences was published by our former colleague, Betsy Frizzell. And that was also published in a similar format, but only focused exclusively on food at home expenditures and consumption. So with this new report, it seemed like a natural follow-up and a complement to Betsy's earlier work, where we would only focus on food away from home consumption. Our second reason for doing this report, and really is a more autonomous reason, is that we've been observing an increasing preponderance of food away from home consumption for some time now, and we thought that that warranted a more in-depth and comprehensive look at different aspects of food away from home consumption. And then finally, food away from home is generally thought of as less nutritious than food at home, which I discuss in upcoming slides. But that has really generated interest for policies that may help to improve the diet quality of food away from home. But of course, for these policies to be effective, there needs to be research that supports any sort of potential policy decisions. So in this presentation, I'm going to present to you a selection of findings from our report. There were a lot of them, and I will start with a discussion of long-term trends that we have observed of various aspects of food away from home. In this graph, shows the share of spending on food at home and food away from home from 1987 to 2017, so essentially the last 30 years. As you can see from the blue line, that food away from home constituted about 44% of the food budget share in 1987, and this has increased to nearly 54% in 2017. You can see where the two lines cross, that corresponds to the year 2010. And this is when we first observed that the expenditure share for food away from home becomes larger than food at home at about 50.2%. And really that trend has continued to grow since then. By contrast, food at home was 56% of the food budget in 1987 and is now 46% in 2017. So when we look at food expenditures in terms of levels spent in real dollars, you can see that Americans have been spending more money on food, both in terms of food away from home and food at home, for the past 30 years. So in terms of levels, 2003 was the first year when total food expenditure for food away from home surpassed food at home expenditure. And if you recall from the previous slide, 2010 is when the share of food away from home became larger than food at home. And you can see that in this graph, that really marks the onset of a wider divergence between spending of food away from home and food at home. I also wanted to note that there are clear effects of the Great Recession, and that's noticeable in the graph with this dip of both expenditures for both food away from home and food at home, starting in 2006 all the way to 2009. And later on in the presentation, I will talk a little bit more about consumption and expenditure during that time period. So the next three slides, I'm going to discuss changes in diet quality as a consequence of food away from home consumption. In this graph, we look at the percent of calories consumed from food away from home over time. in this graph separates households into low income, which are the dotted lines, and high income households, or the solid lines. And we define that here as being at or below 185% of the federal poverty level or above, respectively. As we saw previously with expenditures, you can see that the red lines, which are the calories from all food away from home sources, have increased over time. But for lower income households, it seems to be lesser so. The purple lines, which are fast food, we see that fast food consumption is a bit of an equalizer in terms of percent of calorie consumption, since both lower and higher income households consume food away from home calories at similar percentages, and this seems to actually be consistent over time. We see the real differences in consumption when we look at percent of calories consumed from restaurants, which we define here as food places that have wait staff, which are unlike fast food places. So for high-income households, the percent of calories coming from restaurants increased till 2003, 2004, but then it stayed relatively constant after that, while for lower-income households, the percent of calories coming from restaurants has really just been steadily declining since 1994 through 1998. And then again, similar to the previous slide, the effects of the recession are also noticeable in this graph. And you can see that there's this decline between 2005, 2006 to 2009, 2010. And obviously that kind of roughly corresponds to the Great Recession. And again, in the sort of upcoming slides, I have a full section kind of devoted to the Great Recession. And I'll go more into depth about that. Okay. So this next slide compares the fat content of food away from home and food at home over time. So here the first two bars indicate that all food, so food at home and food away from home combined, has lower fat content in 2011, 2014 than it did in 1977, 1978. And that's because in 1977, 78, the fat content in food at home and total food away from home was virtually identical at about 41 and 41.2% respectively. So then we see that most of the declines in fat content came from food at home by the year 2011 through 2014. And specifically, the fat content of food at home dropped to 32.1% by this time. There was also a drop in fat content of total food away from home, but it was less precipitous at about 4% over time. And there's also a caveat with that total overall 4% drop, and that it masks considerable amount of variation within food away from home categories. So, for example, fat content of school meals, which is a type of food away from home, dropped almost as much as food at home, and it went from 40.1% to 32.6% of calories, while the fat content of fast food, on the other hand, changed very little, and that went from 41.1% in 1977 through 78 to 39.1% in 2011, 2014. So finally, we grouped households by how frequently they patronize food away from home establishments and compared their overall diet quality. So in this graph, we compare the Healthy Eating Index scores, or HEIs, of households. Now, HEIs are a measure that is developed to determine adherence to the dietary guidelines. Scores range from 0 to 100, where a score of 100 represents a perfect score. There is further discussion of how to calculate HEI scores in our report and also directly on the USDA website, which I have at the bottom of this slide if you are interested in how the calculations are made. I think that an interesting result from this graph shows that occasional fast food and full-service consumers have the highest diet quality. And so at first, this seems like a peculiar result, considering that we saw from the previous slide that food away from home generally has more fat in it and is generally less nutritious than food at home. But we think that this result is likely data-driven. So here, HEIs are calculated based on foods that were purchased and not necessarily consumed. So since people tend to buy larger quantities of food at home as opposed to meal-based like food at home, food away from home, this may skew the HEI results. And additionally, as we saw earlier, higher income households tend to buy more food away from home, and they also tend to have higher diet quality, which may be driving this result. I also wanted to mention that Chapter 1 of our report is really just a summary of our findings, but there's also a section in the introduction that discusses the different data sources used for our analysis. There isn't really any definitive definition of what food away from home is, so depending on the data set that you use, there are just definitional nuances across data sets. So if you want to learn more about the differences of data sets, how that impacts the findings that you're interpreting, I would definitely encourage you to go through that section. And I still find it helpful, and I wrote part of it. Okay, so now I'm going to switch gears a little bit, and I'm going to talk about retail trends in food away from home over time. The next two slides, I'm going to discuss changes in the retail landscape across a 15-year time span starting in the year 2000. This map shows countrywide differences in the growth of full-service restaurants, which we have defined as establishments that have wait staff. So though full-service growth varied a lot across the country, and you can see that as like the orange and the growth, at least positive growth, as the orange and red patches. There were large full-service restaurant expansions in these regions just outside of these city cores, and that includes the western suburbs of Chicago, the counties contiguous to Nashville's Davison County, and Loudoun County, which is close to us, west of Washington, D.C., and many of the urban counties in eastern Texas. We think that this growth is a reflection of the population increases in these regions. So in this map, we see that the growth in food away from home has been increasingly dominated by fast food restaurants. And in fact, in most regions of the country, fast food establishments have expanded with the sharpest increases around 30% or more over this 15-year period. And really that has concentrated in the Mid-Atlantic and Southeast. But you can see fast food has also increased in many rural counties across the country. There's just a lot of red and a lot of orange on this map. Okay. So I think we are sort of feeling it to remind you that we have some questions, right, Elaine?
Yes, this is just a reminder as you are listening. If you have questions for Michelle, just type them into the chat box. You'll see that there are a number of people who have added questions already, and so if you want to join them, please do.
Okay. So I'll continue on. So the next several slides, I'm going to discuss food away from home by various segments of the population, which we sort of broadly label as food use, or food away from home use. In this graph, this shows the frequency of food away from home meals consumed on a weekly basis by age. And the graph indicates that individuals who are between the ages of 35 through 44 made the most trips to food away from home establishments than any other age group. And this is actually pretty consistent with other research which indicates that frequency of food away from home consumption is tied to labor participation. So for people who participate in the labor force, they are more likely to patron food away from home establishments. And we feel that it's reasonable to expect that a large percentage of 35 to 44-year-olds are employed, especially when you compare it to other age groups. Frequency of food away from home trips is also tied to socioeconomic status, such as income and education levels. We see here that across all ages, wealthier households, which are defined as those that are at or 300% of the poverty line or above, frequency of food away from home establishments. So there's also this age pattern, which indicates that younger age groups are frequenting food away from home trips more so than older ones. And then similarly, as we grouped households by education level, which is another measure of socioeconomic status, and here we define the education groups as high school or less, 2-year degree and some college, and then college graduate or higher. We see that in general, more educated households also make more food away from home trips than less educated households. So the next 3 slides depict consumption of food away from home by participation in federal food assistance programs. So this graph in particular shows the share of calories from food away from home by income and by source over time for households with children. So the red lines indicate shares of calories from fast food for higher income households, which is a solid line, and lower income households, or the dotted line, with children. And both indicate an increasing trend in share of fast food calories over time for both of these households. To be specific, in 1977-78, fast food provided less than 4% of the mean daily energy intake of children and youth. Their intake of calories from fast food then peaked at 16.5% of total calories in 2003-2004, but then declined again at 12.6% in 2009-2010, which is probably an artifact of the recession, and then rose again to 16% by 2013-2014. The blue lines show the share of food away from home calories from school foods, which is a type of food away from home. As expected, lower income children receive more calories from school foods than higher income children, but over time the amount of calories sourced from school food has declined. So in particular, in 1977 through 78, school foods provided almost 9% of total calories, but are now just anywhere from 6 to 7% of calories for children since 2003. So in this graph, I'm revisiting HEI scores. HEIs are calculated as an aggregate measure of food subcomponents that are all listed in this graph. And again, for a more in-depth explanation of how the HEIs are calculated, you can refer to the report or the HEI website that I provided in an earlier slide. We find that food acquired at school, which are the blue bars, had a significantly higher HEI score than other food away from home, or the green bars. And to be specific, on average, total HEI is 49 for school-acquired food, and that's compared to 46 for other food away from home. In terms of component-wise, a school food had higher total fruit, whole grains, and dairy subcomponent scores. So in this next graph, we measured the HEIs of households based on participation in the USDA's Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, which was formerly known as food stamps. we see that the diet quality of food away from home is fairly similar across participation status. And it would indicate that differences in HEI scores is a result of diet quality of food at home consumption and not necessarily food away from home. And additionally, that these similarities would seem to indicate that there are strong consumer preferences for food away from home consumption. Okay, so like I had mentioned earlier, many of the slides indicated some Great Recession impacts, and this is the section that I'm devoting to talking about consumption and expenditures during that time. So in this figure, the shaded red area indicates the recession period. We see that real spending on food away from home, which is the blue line, declined by 18%, or $47 billion from 2006 to 2010, and then really remained below its 2005 level through 2014. Meanwhile, during that same period, so 2005 through 2014, food at-home expenditures, which is shown by the orange line, exceeded 2005 levels in every year except for 2010 and reached a peak at in 2013 at 5%, or $19 billion above the initial level. In this graph, we looked at changes in expenditures by food source and type. So shares of food expenditures spent at full-service restaurants remained 4% below pre-recession shares in 2014, which is indicated by the green line. Not surprisingly, spending on prepared and ready-to-heat foods, which are the yellow and purple lines, which we sort of think of as food-at-home substitutes for food away from home, increased during the recession, but then has declined quite rapidly in 2014. And then finally, fast food purchases, which is the blue line, declined rapidly from 2007 to 2008, but has steadily increased since then in 2014. We also looked at the percent of calories from food sources during this time. This graph indicates that between 2007 and 2010, the share of calories obtained away from home briefly dipped to 29.1% in 2009 and 2010. And in particular, fast food, which is the leading food away from home source, dropped to 13.2%, but has rebounded since then. This graph also separates households into households with and without children, and we see that both types of households follow similar consumption patterns over time. Okay, so finally, the last section, I am going to discuss the subject of menu labeling. So as we have seen earlier, food away from home is generally less healthy than food at home. So there have been policy initiatives which have been put in place to change the healthfulness of food away from home offerings. And menu labeling is one of those such policies. To track how food offerings from restaurants that provide nutritional information have changed over time, a special study was conducted by ERS in the spring of 2012 and then a follow-up in the fall of 2015. And public nutrition data was collected on 6 chain full-service restaurants in Montgomery County, Maryland. And the data showed that in 2012, more items were being offered in the less than 769 and 769 to 973 calorie range than there were in 2015. And then additionally, there were more high-calorie offerings offered in 2015. But in general, the results from menu labeling have been mixed. So this is only one study, but other studies have shown that full-service restaurants have actually been offering lower-calorie foods, while fast food places haven't really changed their caloric offerings. Finally, this graph separates individuals into groups based on how frequently they eat dark green vegetables at home, which we sort of consider as a health-seeking behavior. And as you can see from the graph, eating dark green vegetables doesn't really affect how often you eat at full-service restaurants. And in fact, people who eat or who consider themselves to eat more dark green vegetables go to full-service restaurants more often than those who rarely eat green veggies. Really the differences in behaviors are more pronounced in the way individuals use the nutrition information. So less than 10% of rare or never dark green vegetable eaters saw the nutritional information when it was provided. And among those that did notice the nutrition information, only 20% of them use the information to make their decisions, their food decisions, as opposed to 55% of dark green veggie eaters. It's really still unknown to us whether nutrition information will have an impact on people's food choices. So for example, we aren't really able to tell whether the 20% of rare eaters who ended up using the nutritional information are 20% of people who would have not otherwise used the nutritional information, or whether these individuals would have used the nutritional information anyways. And really only time can tell how menu labeling will impact food away from home consumption. And so that kind of concludes my slides. Just as some concluding remarks, I just wanted to summarize some of the recurring patterns that we saw in this report. The first one is that Americans are eating more food away from home, and we saw that in terms of expenditures, nutrition, and food retailing trends. Second, there's a great variety in use, and we saw that across demographics such as income, education, and SNAP participation. We found that the Great Recession had, a big impact on food consumption. And we saw that expenditures of food away from home went down during this period, as well as there was this pattern of substitution towards food at home replacements, like ready-to-heat foods. We also found that fast food seems to be this great equalizer across income. The amount of consumption of fast food, whether it be measured in HEI scores or shares of calories from fast food, was very similar across income distribution. And then finally, menu labeling. The results from menu labeling are still mixed. As of now, the research seems to show that people who are health conscious are using the info, but others who aren't necessarily health conscious may not be using the nutrition information yet, and only time will tell if they will sort of adapt to the new information. And that's it. This is my contact information. If you think of any questions after this presentation, please feel free to email myself or my colleague Abigail, and we can hopefully answer your questions or direct you to the right people for that. And I think now we're going to field it to questions.
Yes, thank you so much. That was just fabulous, and there have been a number of questions asked during your presentation, Michelle, and I can tell you that I'm going to download this report just after the webinar. There's so much richness of information. It's a lot to contemplate, and some of the questions we've gotten are talk about some of the implications. But just to get started, early on, there were a couple of questions about how you define food away from home and at home. You did mention, for example, that let's start with food away from home. That included school cafeterias, and in general, even though I know some of your data sources had a little bit different definitions, in general, what would be included there for food away from home?
Yeah, so food away from home generally includes restaurants, cafeterias, food trucks, and vending machines. And then food at home would be food that you would obtain from grocery stores, from a warehouse club, or a super center, something that you get in the mail, those kinds of things.
And so you mentioned just a minute ago food ready to heat at home.
Yes.
Is that at home or is that?
Yeah, so that depends on the data set that you use.
Okay.
So most of the data sets that are used in this report would consider prepared foods as a food at home thing, or food at home food, except for the, let's see, what is it called? The Food Expenditures data series, which is an ERS data product. That classifies food as food where it's meant to be eaten. And so depending on where you're eating that food, it could be considered food away from home or food at home.
So that is a cue for all of us to read a little bit more about the data sets in the report.
Yeah.
But just to delve into that a minute more, there were a lot of data sets, a lot of different data were analyzed in the report. So can you tell us a little bit about the pros and cons of using the different kinds of data to examine food away from home?
Yeah, sure. I think the biggest pro is that you get a more comprehensive look at food away from home. Not every data set is going to have every single variable of interest in it. So for example, NHANES, which a lot of the graphs in the presentation derive the results from NHANES, it has a very, a wealth of nutritional information, but it doesn't have prices or expenditure patterns. So, the pros are that you can see, more sides of the consumption of food away from home. The cons would be that it's hard to compare and contrast results across data sets because they aren't necessarily defining food away from home in the same way. But to that end, we never really saw any sort of very drastically different results either. So even though there are these sort of definitional nuances, they all seem to kind of be fairly consistent with each other in the results.
Oh, well, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So, here's another question. Is there any reference in the full report to data about the types of food that people are ordering in addition to green leafy vegetables?
Like how, so some of the chapters segregate it by sort of like the place, like so fast food versus full service restaurants. But I don't think we have any sort of distinguishing like how many servings of, carrots or anything.
Right.
We don't do that in this report. Nothing goes to that detail.
Okay. I'm just thinking, are there other sources for that kind of data from USDA?
So, yes, there are many sources. There are, so you mean sources for like the nutritional, like the...
Well, what people are actually eating at home or away from home.
Yeah, so I think the NHANES data set will tell you a little bit about that, and then also Food Apps, which is an ERS data project, that will give you the types of foods that people are eating.
And can you just briefly define Food Apps and how people can find it?
Yeah, so Food Apps is a data set that we helped to create at ERS. I can send a link to where you can find it, but essentially it is food acquisition and purchase data. So we survey households over a week time span, and then they report to us all the foods that they've purchased, and that includes food at home and food away from home. And I can provide a link to the website for Food Apps.
Okay, we can do that. Thank you as a follow-up. And then there were a couple of questions about any links between food away from home, any data about links between food away from home and illness, and or any discussion of better health or lowered obesity rates after the recession. So are there any essays or other information in the full report addressing those kinds of issues?
Yeah, so actually we did have we did some work that looked at obesity and food away from home. It was inconclusive, so it didn't really make it into the report. But that being said, that data is in food apps, and it's sort of an area that needs more exploration, but we didn't necessarily cover it in this report.
Okay.
Yes.
And then another question, how much do you think that the fast casual restaurant boom has impacted increases in food away from home?
A lot. We actually had a slide that had that in here, but for time constraints, I kind of took it out. So the fast casual sector has really been driving a lot of, at least on the retail side, food away from home. And it's really changing quite the sort of the retail landscape. And it's kind of this really cool sort of trend that we're still following. And I think it's going to be it is and will continue to be a very impactful or retailing method or modality for food away from home, particularly since it kind of has sort of the attributes of fast food, where it's very convenient and fast, but it kind of has this like ambiance of higher dining restaurants. And I know that particularly sort of caters to millennials who like to eat out more so, that we've been finding. So I think yeah, it's going to be it is a big impact in the food away from home landscape.
And thank you. And you mentioned millennials. What do you see as the potential impact of millennials on overall growth of food away from home beyond just fast casual?
I think so. Beyond fast casual, I'm not so sure. I think millennials really love this idea of convenience. So, like sit-down restaurants may still not be appealing to millennials. In this report, we don't really do any sort of forecasting. So it's really, it remains to be said what millennials how they will impact like the full-service restaurant industry. But I do think that, millennials do love to go eat out, and I think they are, a big driver of the fast casual trend and really the fast food trend. And so it remains to be seen that, once they start getting older and they start having children, if that is going to impact the way that they purchase food away from home or how their preferences change over time. But I do kind of see it kind of going there, supporting this sort of trend of increased food away from home.
Interesting. So here's another question. Is there any data that you're aware of on the relative quality and health of fast casual versus traditional fast food?
I can't think of anything right now. There might be something in food apps. I'm not quite sure in terms of whether we delineate between fast casual and fast food, but I can look that up for you. I definitely know which authors would know that question.
Oh, that'd be great.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks so much. And then still looking at food away from home, what about links between food deserts and food away from home? Is there any discussion of that in the report?
So in kind of, so I think Chapter 8, which, yeah, is that Chapter 8? Chapter 6, sorry. Chapter 6 is the chapter that goes through changes in food retailing over time. And those are all the slides that had the pretty maps on them.
Uh-huh.
And I had mentioned earlier that there is a lot of fast food growth in rural areas, which are not necessarily food deserts, but tend to be. And I think in that chapter that probably goes into more details with that. I'm not quite sure. I can't give any discrete statistics, but I think Chapter 8 or Chapter 6, sorry, would be a good place to start.
Okay, great. And another question, is there any significant difference in the effects of food away from home diet in adults and children? I don't know whether that's something that anyone addressed in a chapter?
Yeah, so we, you mean health outcomes? Is that what?
I would assume.
Yeah, so we didn't really focus on that, mostly because most of the authors of this are economists and not nutritionists. We don't know for sure. It kind of is outside of the purview of this report. I can only sort of imagine that there are differences, but I can't really say for sure.
Right.
If there are any long-term effects of food away from home on health.
And there were a number of related questions about any better health or lowered obesity rates after the recession, or any impact on healthcare impacts or hospital admissions. A number of questions about what happens as a result of patterns of at home and away from home. So I assume that that's probably the same thing, that it's a little bit outside of what this report is. But all of you who have asked those questions, they're very important ones, and I'm sure there are other researchers looking at them. I think I want to close with a question that relates to some of the unanswered questions in the report, and that is, are you planning any follow-up research to further explore this data?
Not in the sort of format as this report was. If there is any follow-up report, it'll be probably more in our sort of 30 to 50 page format. We're working on this stuff all the time, so I don't know what everybody else's research is at ERS, but I know from my work, I do a lot of stuff with millennials, and I'm working on a project right now that looks at, looking at, what makes millennials the way that they are, and why do they sort of purchase more food away from home than other cohorts. So yeah, this is, an ongoing topic. I think this report wasn't meant to be sort of like the end-all, be-all of food away from home. It was very much a synthesis of research that has already been happening, and we wanted to push the research a little bit more, and then really to start or to, stimulate further research into food away from home.
Well, this is a very deep and rich report, and certainly a lot more than could be covered in this brief presentation. But thanks for whetting our appetite for more, both in the report and these good sort of analytic questions about what does it all mean. So I just want to note that on the web links that you can see on the screen, there is a in addition to a link to the full report, there's a link to the NCCOR website, and ERS and other components of USDA are very active in NCCOR. And if there's anyone here who's not a regular follower of NCCOR, we encourage you to do that, because this is where a lot of sharing of new reports will happen. So, Michelle, thank you so much for being with us. It's, as I said, a very rich resource. Congratulations on getting this large report put together, and it must have been an enormous effort. And thank you so much for sharing it with us today.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having me. So.
Yes, just great. And before we go, just a quick little ad here. NCCOR is going to be at APHA. Presenting Tools of the Trade, NCCOR Resources for Evidence-Based Practice in Diet and Physical Activity. So that's an overview of several NCCOR tools and some case studies on how the tools can be used in real-world context. So if you are at APHA, you can find the NCCOR folks at 3 p.m. Pacific time on November 13. You can see here on the screen the presenters. In addition, NCCOR will have a booth at the conference, so you're welcome to come. And if you have further questions, there's a place to start to find some answers. So if you have other questions about NCCOR upcoming activities and you're not at APHA, anytime, just email the NCCOR Coordinating Center at ncor@fhi360.org. And just want to remind you that Michelle's presentation, it will be archived and displayed here on the website. And to access the webinar, use the top navigation and click on Webinars. So you can see, we'll see, once we've got it up there, this archived webinar and a number of others that have been presented, and all the upcoming webinars will be here as well. So we encourage you to revisit this presentation. It's a lot to absorb, and also we hope that you will share it with your peers. We think it's a very exciting report. And thank you, Michelle, for agreeing to follow up on a couple of issues. There have been a couple of resources and links in the Everyone chat box. And if there is additional information, we will provide it as a follow-up. So thank you. Thank you again to Michelle. And a special thank you to everyone who took time to be with us this afternoon. We're grateful to have you, and we'd love to get your questions. And before you sign off, just if you would take 1 minute to complete our brief survey, because your responses help us shape future webinars and make sure we make the best use of your time. So we're going to switch over to the feedback form now. You can write your response directly on the screen and hit submit, and have a wonderful afternoon, and I hope that you'll have a chance to vote today. Good afternoon.
This concludes today's conference call. Thank you for your participation. You may now disconnect. Presenters, please stay online for your post-conference